Thank you guys for joining us for tonight's event on Asian America, AAPI Identities and Experiences. Thank you. My name's Asia Lara, and I'm a program manager at Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We at Humanities Washington acknowledge that we present this program from the traditional and occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples. We ask for those participating in this event, wherever they may be, to reflect on the lands they inhabit and to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. Humanities Washington also wishes to recognize that this conversation does not represent the breadth or depth of Asian American and Pacific Islander experiences, but we hope that this is just the first of many more to come. This event is part of a collaborative initiative in partnerships with stations KUOW, Spokane Public Radio, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. Check out their special broadcasts coming up on May 27th, May 30th, and June 6th. Visit humanities.org for more information on this series. We also just released our new Speakers Bureau roster for the 2021 through 2023 cycle and have several upcoming events. So please check out our calendar to register for talks such as The Country That Fiction Built and the Ethics of Climate Change. If you're interested in supporting programs like these, please consider donating also through humanities.org. Before we begin, please note that this is a recorded event. Tonight, our panelists will be taking questions following the discussion. Please submit your questions at any point through the Q&A box. Our goal at Humanities Washington is to create space where we can have important conversations in a civil manner. Harassment or otherwise inappropriate behavior will result in removal from the event. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the night. Born and raised in Guam and having received her PhD from Washington State University, Dr. Tabitha Espina is now an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition at Eastern Oregon University. Her research interests include cultural rhetoric, AAPI experiences, island feminisms, decolonization, and the public humanities. Tabitha facilitates this panel discussion from the ancestral lands of the Nez Perce, Nimiipuu, Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes. We acknowledge their continuing connection to this land, water, and community, and pay our respects to these original stewards of Northeast Oregon. And without further ado, please take it away, Tabitha.
Sidzus Mo'asi for that very generous introduction, Asia, as well as for contextualizing this very important conversation. Buenas and Hafaday, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to invite our esteemed panelists to please introduce themselves to our audience before we begin our conversation.
I'll go ahead and start. My name is Ron Chu, and I guess I'm retired or semi-retired. I spent a number of years as a community journalist at the International Examiner. Worked for the Wynn Museum for 17 years and spent 10 years in community health, and now trying to do more writing and independent projects.
Well, I'll go next. My name is Carrie Hui Pasqua. Born and raised in Ellensburg, Washington. Both my parents are immigrants. For myself, I I'm also, like Ron, sort of retired, but I have 45 years in behavioral health background and involved in a number of communities right now, and a lot of interests in gardening and just being able to share our experiences and stories with, our family, friends, and have an opportunity to really bring people together.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Liu, and I'm a professor in the Department of English at the University of Washington. I've been teaching there for over 20 years, and I teach courses like Asian American literature and stories about writing that ask people to get in touch with their own experiences as part of the learning process of learning about how our worlds are structured. And I am the granddaughter of a laundryman. And on one side of the family, and the other side of the family immigrated here in 1946. So I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you all and to learn from my fellow panelists tonight. And my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you all for those very warm and welcoming introductions. I hope that the rest of those watching are able to share in with just as much enthusiasm. As I've mentioned, it is a distinct honor to be able to share this space with you all and to be able to talk about these very important and significant topics, especially in light of recent events. And so as we begin this conversation, the way that it was framed is with regards to Asian American Pacific Islander identity. So I'd like to begin by first talking about that term. Specifically, I wanted to ask, how do you understand the term AAPI or any of its variants, like APA for the Asian Pacific American Pan-Ethnic Identity, or APITA for Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, that intentionally includes South Asians, Desi, as part of our community? Or in other words, how does the term fit or maybe not fit in how you self-identify? Or more concretely, how has this term been used in your fields of experience, in your expertise, or in the various contexts and spaces that you inhabit?
Maybe I'll take a stab, if I could, at that. Language is very malleable and evolves. When I was much younger, the term Asian American didn't really exist, and Pacific Islander, nobody heard that term. When I was very young, as a Chinese American, I self-identified as a Chinese American, or even more specifically, because my parents were from the Hoisan district in China, we called ourselves Hoisanyan and not Chinese Americans. And obviously the term has evolved. Asian American evolved during the 1970s, 60s, and 70s as a political term to bring together folks under a common political agenda. Even when that evolution happened, we migrated from Oriental American. I mean, that was the term used in some of my classes, Oriental American to Asian American, Oriental being considered a term that connoted conjured certain stereotypic images. Filipino Americans then began to argue, well, we're not technically Oriental, if you want to even use that term. So it's continually broadened. South Asians said, well, we're not part of the mix. Pacific Islanders, and we're on and on. But I think it's important to continue to evolve and ultimately to go becoming inclusive, and then reflecting kind of where society is moving, but then ultimately self-defining.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Ron. I mean, growing up as a young person, we didn't hear the word Asian American, and like you, I'm Chinese, and in fact, one of the terms that as a young person we used amongst ourselves was ABC, American-born Chinese. So there for a while, that term kind of resonated with us because we're Chinese, but we're born here in America. We're Americans. Later, as I began working with other Asian Pacific Islander groups, I found that all of the people that I worked with from Korea, from the Philippines, from Vietnam, Cambodia, Samoa, they didn't use the term Asian American. And it was much more, the identification was from their country, their language, much more specific. I think that there was an understanding that we had characteristics that brought us together. And in fact, a lot of the places that I worked, our work and our agency was described as being Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander services. So there was that grouping together, but we were all, of course, very distinct in how we identified ourselves. And so The term, and as you said, yes, the term evolves over time. But when we focus on self-identification, I don't think that I think the other thing too is it depends on what group of people that we're with. So with other Asian people, we identify more specifically, oh, I'm American-born Chinese. But with people who are perhaps non-Asian, we identify ourselves as Asian in this broader term. So I think where we are, who we're with, so there's a shift in terms of that identification.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on what Carrie said about how the term means something different depending who we're presenting to. The story I think it came to me why we use the term Asian American is kind of encapsulated in the birth certificates in my three siblings. There's about 11 years difference between me and my youngest. On my birth certificate, it says my parents are Oriental. And my sister's birth certificate, it was born 4 years later, it says her race is yellow. 4 years later, on my brother's certificate, it says he's Asian. And then, like 2 years later, it's on my youngest sister's, it says Chinese. And it's really interesting to see just in that 11-year span, how much contestation there is about what to call a group of people in the United States who is not well placed within a Black and white racial binary. What do you call this group of people who trouble this notion that there are two races in the United States? And so it's really interesting to see how that term has fluxed from the 1970s, when I first came into this earth, until how I am now. The term, there's so many different ways of describing this community. Some of them are more capacious and some of them are narrower. But I think what all of these terms are trying to get at as a way to describe the richness and variety of experiences there are in the United States, for one, and also when we think of a term that can include more people, how it puts pressure on what we consider American and what we consider Asian. It's a term that doesn't mean anything much outside of the United States. Like when I talk to people from Australia or people from Israel, Asia, the concept of Asia means nothing to them. It's like, what? All these people you call Asian in the United States? And I say, yes. But it's a term because it means nothing. It means we have such an opportunity to define what it means for ourselves as well, and to push back on how it has been defined for us.
Thank you all for those deep insights, particularly as you describe the terms being political, having the potential for self-definition, and being inclusive, and that they describe a richness of experiences. I also liked how you described how the terms move back and forth between distinction and connection for different purposes, and ultimately how there's a lot of power in the names we are given and the names that we give ourselves. And so speaking on those complexities and perhaps expanding on the nuances that you've begun to describe, what are some complexities of using the term AAPI today? How can we use this term furthermore to build solidarity while recognizing its limits, such as in not conflating Asian American experiences with Pacific Islander experiences? You've all mentioned that ordinarily, it's used as an all-encompassing term, and that can be very beneficial in building solidarity. But at the same time, how can we affirm the distinction among the different cultures and share in that richness in very specific ways?
Well, I would like to just share a little bit about, even currently and certainly in the past, in places that I've worked. So in my early days, I was in San Francisco Bay Area. And at that time, an innovative program was started at San Francisco General Hospital. And it was called the Asian Unit. So there it was up on the 7th or 8th floor, I think it was, and it was grouping together people who, Asians, who diet was more similar, yet all the staff had to be very distinct in their language, cultural background, and ability to work with all the patients on that unit. And yet the term, of course, was used, the Asian unit at San Francisco General Hospital. Later on, in other places that I worked, we replicated that model, a program within a program. And even then, I ran a Asian residential services program in San Francisco. So there were residential treatment services, but it was a program within a program. So here we were, bringing together staff that had similar characteristics, physical characteristics, black hair, perhaps some similarities in food and things like that. So I think it's a real challenge. On the one hand, we have to respect and honor all of the distinctive languages, culture, variations within our culture, each distinct person, but yet at the same time, we're utilizing the term to, whether it was getting funding, getting specific services together. So I think that, when we used it for solidarity, we used it to gain a critical mass, I think, for funding for services. And yet at the same time, we were met with this challenge of the diversity. And I think, really having to help people understand that we didn't all speak the same language. We had to apply all these specifics to working with each person.
Tabitha, to your question, I think ultimately we're moving towards this notion of disaggregating data and groups. During the time when I was growing up, it was a relatively more homogenous community. Now it's bigger and it's demographically very, very diverse. So ultimately, if we continue moving that direction, it's the right thing to do. What Carrie talked about, obviously, government programs that require certain statistical data that's gathered forces you into a box. And the US Census obviously created certain categories that, again, become less and less relevant as the community evolves. I think an important part of that discussion really is also about having enough openness to ask people how they want to be regarded. We also have, I keep in mind in my lifetime, we've had a huge adoptee population, Asian adoptee population that's grown up, and they struggle with issues of identity. And again, we need to hear their voices. People of mixed ancestry, there's a growing population of folks like that who identify with a number of different groups. So again, it's being open, and I think ultimately moving towards disaggregating and getting to a point where we respect each person as an individual.
Yeah, and I'll speak from how I experience Asian Americanness as someone who works with literature and storytelling. Every year, at least one time, I get the privilege of being able to teach an Asian American literature course at the University of Washington, Seattle location. Most of the people who enroll have some kind of Asian heritage. Sometimes they're mixed race, as Ron mentioned. Sometimes they're adoptees. A lot of them, some of them are recent immigrants. Some of them are international students. Some of them, their families have been here for quite a long time from all over this giant landmass and islands that we call Asia. And it's the first question we ask is if they identify as Asian American. Very few do. As the quarter goes on, when we read things that have been included under Asian American literature, they begin to get more of a sense of what this term can do to bring about unity, but also honor the differences within each of our communities. And it starts with doing so much reparative work on the kind of shame or self-silencing they've done because they've grown up being designated as an invisibilized model minority in the United States. And even though the model minority sounds like a compliment, the idea that people of Asian heritage, they have systematic racism doesn't apply to Asians because we're able to rise by means of education to get to high-paying professions. It ignores all the different ways that Asians have been conscripted within a Black and white racial binary to prove that whiteness as a system works for everyone. And the more we talk about these stories from people who can be widely included in an Asian American background, we sense a sameness in all of us in how we have been made invisible, or that our voices have been shaped into saying what we think other people think we're supposed to say. And so when we're in literature and we're thinking of making new stories, crafting in this land of imagination, new ways of being, people find it very inspiring as a way they can take the particularities of their individual experience and yet have it connect to other people's in ways that honor differences. So for me, as someone who works in literature, we're thinking about this question all the time: how can writing and how can fiction help us imagine different ways of connecting with each other so we can do the difficult mission it is to bring us all together and move us all in the same direction while honoring the differences we have. It's a micro project that's important to Asian America, but it's also a project that's important to America at large, of how to recognize differences and use these differences as a strength rather than as a disadvantage.
Thank you all for tackling that difficult question about complexity, forcing us to confront some of the names, again, that we have given ourselves or have been conscribed to our experiences. And I like that you also talked about the pragmatic aspect of the term, grouping by similarities, which at the same time lends itself to challenge, because you want to respect and honor the distinctive language and cultures and find connection between them. But at the same time, you want to move beyond perceptions of homogeneity, and also move beyond the racialization of that term. And so that can be a difficult balance. But as Ron had mentioned, it's something that many are moving towards, disaggregating the term, not necessarily to undo that solidarity, but instead to really take a look at the various experiences that it comprises. And so I also appreciated the openness of interrogating that term, the openness in talking with one another, asking, how do you feel about that term? How does it fit with your experience? How does it fit with how you see and, as Michelle said, imagine the world? And of course, it gives people something to grasp onto, but one that is malleable and that we can talk with one another about in community, for the purposes of unity. So I really liked that you brought up that term, unity, because essentially that's what the term is meant to do. And even when it doesn't reach that end, we can strive towards it by talking about the complexity and by talking about the complications of AAPI as a term and the various terms that are used in lieu of that. I also like, Michelle, how you brought up how shame and self-silencing are reflected in our attitudes towards the term. And I think that is a perfect transition into our next question. Can you speak to how issues of invisibility and trauma complicate the quote unquote model minority myth, how it continues to harm us?
If I might, so, the reason why this disaggregation is important, and recognizing the diversity is important. More recently, we've been confronting this wave of anti-Asian violence, and this continuing attempt to foreignize the AAPI population here. And it's made possible by the fact that, for the longest time, people didn't recognize the distinctions between the different groups. So, go back to where you came from, go back to China, could be said to somebody who's not necessarily even from China, or necessarily ethnically Chinese. It just, in Hollywood, you had a lot of stereotyping, which created this sort of homogenized, really exaggerated media image that really corrupted who we were as individuals, and not to mention being inaccurate. So we've lost that sense of we're battling against a long history. Anti-Asian violence is not anything new. We look back in history, and it's been years since the origins of our community, despite many of us having contributed to the development of this region in many, many ways. So yeah, it's it's an interesting time, but again, it's I'm feeling really hopeful, because it's also a time where we have a new generation of young folks who are taking up the activism that has infused the community throughout the years, and it's enabled us to reach a point where we can begin to push back against a lot of the stereotyping.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the complexity and the trauma and indivisibility related to model minority. Yeah, I think that the term was coined in the mid-60s, and was actually related to Japanese Americans, and then very quickly began to be related to anyone that had, Asian features. And I think the real, again, as Michelle had said earlier, it sounds like it's a compliment, but in fact, it is not. It really polarizes the AAPI term and model minority to polarizes with other ethnic groups, right? So if you're not AAPI, if you're not Asian, then you're not a model minority. It could also be used to denigrate other ethnic groups. So I think that that's a real, I think from personal characteristic, it's really hard because we're raised to be, well, for myself, behave well. I mean, like I said, I was born and raised in this small town, very, very visible by our difference. At the same time, behave well so that we don't stick out. So at one point, we're very obvious, very visible, but we're trying to fly under the radar all the time. Just try to, don't rock the boat, worried about drawing attention to ourselves and everything. So on the one hand, it just seemed like, oh, your behavior is just like what we describe as a model minority. You work hard, don't break any laws, or whatever is embodied in that term of being a model minority, a model citizen. you know, within America. And the challenge is, I mean, we, and again, the term minority, right? We're not in the majority, and that whole sense that we are different, than the main population. So other people have just said, you know, we're other, we're forever foreign, we're not Americans necessarily. It's very hard to, when, just as Ron said, you know, well, you know, go back to where you came from. Well, I was born and raised here, you know, go back to your country. And people ask, oh, well, where are you from? Well, I'm from Ellensburg. No, where are you really? I mean, where are you really from? I mean, that's where you lived before, but where are you really from? And then finally they realize, oh, well, where are your parents from? What ethnic group are you from? So I think that those are all challenges that I think every single one of us have heard, have faced, have experienced, and getting back to that invisibility and the trauma of having to be other than ourselves, I think, and feeling like, oh, you won't accept the fact that I'm born and raised here. You keep thinking I'm supposed to be from someplace else, and that non-acceptance can be very difficult for young people. You know, I think I hear more from our younger generation now that they really understand that the term model minority is in fact not, it's not a compliment. And I hear from other young Asian Americans that really understand that, yeah, we are not a model minority.
Yeah, I'm thinking so much based off what Ron and Carrie said. And hey, let me just start a little bit with what Ron said about, because he brought up or the visibility that's been given to anti-Asian violence right now. And I agree with Ron that the kind of violence that we see in the news is something that's been going on for a long time. Like, I remember I was talking with a colleague earlier about anti-Asian violence, and she says, well, you know, it's great that we're getting called and people want to hear from us, but we're saying the same things that we were when Vincent Chin was murdered in the 1980s, when two men killed or beat a father and son, beat up Vincent Chin and killed him with a baseball bat because they blamed him as a Chinese American for Japanese cars eviscerating the Detroit American auto industry. And she says, we're saying the same thing. She's saying we're here, we're visible. But I feel like maybe what's different now, especially in the wake of pairing how anti-Asian violence nests in with the discussions and the protests we're getting about anti-Black violence, is our willingness to listen differently. And I'll just give a personal example for this. About 3 years ago, you know, pre-pandemic, you know, when life, quote, quote, felt normal, my parents were walking downtown Sacramento, and they came back from this walk, and my dad said, someone just tried to hit me. Someone just took a punch at me. And we're like, what? He says, yeah, I was just walking along and this guy threw a punch at me. And we said, what did you do? He says, well, I blocked it. He grew up in New York City as the only Asian kid. He got in a lot of fights. So he still had this body reflex or how to deflect a punch coming at him. But he told this to my sister, my two sisters and I, and we had a hard time believing him. We're like, what? Dad must be exaggerating. Why would anyone just randomly throw a punch at this older Asian man and his wife walking down the street? But I realized in our response then, we were kind of replicating this desire not to hear this kind of story. It's like, how could this happen? It's this realm of disbelief that how could this be happening? And I see so many of the attacks on Asians that have been publicized, the ones that have been caught on camera, are against elderly or people who read as elderly. Um, and I think about why that is, and instead of being able to explain it away, it's like, oh, that must be just a one-off. I think people are willing at this particular moment to be able to see it as part of a pattern and to realize that it's not, that we can declare our prides in our various ancestral backgrounds, but there's something else that needs to change too in how we are heard and listened to. Part of it starts with how we hear and listen to ourselves, for sure. And that we're trying to listen to these moments of pain, not because we're trying to capitalize on the victimizations, not because someone has hurled microaggressions at us, or not because someone, even not that someone has physically attacked us, but that these individual stories are pointing to a larger need to restructure our understanding of what people are saying to us when they say something bad to us. It's not about individual pain. It's not about someone trying to work the system to gain attention for themselves. It's about something deeper and larger, about how there's right now there's a systematic failure in our larger imaginations about how to acknowledge the pain that has happened in the past and how it continues to live in the presence. I mean, when I hear the land acknowledgements before so many events, this is what I'm thinking about. It's how to acknowledge that something bad has happened, and rather than just saying, oh, it was a one-off, oh, it was a long time ago, that these moments continue to live in the present. And part of acknowledging that is learning intellectually about what has been made invisible. But it's also changing the stance about how we listen to it, a willingness to say, yes, this happened. How do we tell a different story so that we don't try to distance the person to whom it happened, but saying, yes, we will walk with you in what has happened, whether that happened to someone we know personally or just how someone, what happens to someone who will never know. Okay. And for me, that's why Asian American is, or Asian American AAPI, or all the 1,000 iterations of what is included in it is so interesting to me. I mean, the latest stretch for my personal imagination is the inclusion of West Asians under the term Asian American PI, people who we would, in the United States, we would think of being part of the Middle East. And we include people who are Muslim, who are Arab, under this umbrella. It radically changes who we think who can belong and why, and dealing with our own prejudice about who we hear and who we don't. So it's a term that makes me really interested and keeps me open, or keeps reminding me all the different ways that I need to listen differently.
Can I jump in, Tabitha, and share a story as I was listening to Michelle talk? So I recently authored a book, no shameless plug. It's titled My Unforgotten Seattle, but it's about growing up in the era of the 1960s and 70s during the Civil Rights Movement. My father worked in a restaurant in the Chinatown International District called the Hong Kong Restaurant, one of the big chop suey restaurants back in the day. He worked there for 30 years as a waiter. And I worked there for 10 years myself, trying to get some money to go to college, because I was the first college educated generation in my family. But during that time working there with my father, you know, the racism was very direct. You know, people called you boy, you know, get me this. You know, this is to my father. And I'm sitting there, you know, as a 13, 14-year-old. Back then we didn't have child labor laws, you know, and it, you know, it made me angry, you know. And then they would, you know, call everybody Charlie. Well, that wasn't my father's name, you know. But during that time period, as I was growing up and going to school, Bruce Lee became a big icon within our community. He was good friends with one of the waiters there, and he'd go back in the kitchen in the restaurant and these electrical traits. We thought he was a little crazy, but as I reflect on that time period, so everybody wanted to be like Bruce, and it was because in some ways he was a non-stereotype, and not having a voice or a way to fight back, you kind of latched on to these images, these people who could provide you some voice, even as sort of a surrogate. When I was, I write about this as well, when I was attending elementary school, probably the most traumatic thing that happened to me was when my mother used to take me to school and drop me off. I remember one incident where she entered the school and was confronted by an administrator who didn't want her speaking Chinese. So she, the administrator told me, well, tell your mother if she comes in the building, she should speak English. And so my mother asked me what this person was saying, and I was too embarrassed to tell her. So I just said it was nothing and, went back home. From that day forward, I tried to leave my last class early so she wouldn't come into the building. And the ironic thing is, actually, I never shared that story until many years later at El Centro de la Raza. Roberto Maestas, the director, he was crowned the Seafarer honorary, I think it's Captain Neptune or King Neptune, that's right. And so I said, well, the school, essentially La Raza, used to be my old elementary school, and it's kind of a proud moment to be here with you because this is the same place where I never wanted to come back. I share these stories, I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge what was real for us and then to share that. My parents, and I know Carrie, we talked a little bit about that. Many Chinese, as my family, came here illegally because it was illegal for Chinese to come here under the Chinese Exclusion Act. So my grandfather came here illegally, as did my father and my uncles. Over 90% of Chinese came here illegally. Is it a badge of shame? I don't think so. They came here, they were recruited to work, and my uncle came, he fought and died for this country in Italy in World War II as part of the 87th Mountain Division. At the same time, my mother couldn't come here to this country. We have a place here, we have a voice, and our experience mirrors that of a lot of other groups. I think about the DACA kids now and, what they're going through, because, I felt that need to try to be invisible and not to say stuff because you don't want to be deported, right? And so, and that feeds into a stereotype, well, Asians are passive. Well, why, So there's a lot of conundrums we face as we face our own history. And my hope is, number one, that everybody buys my book. It's a benefit for a nonprofit. And also that people begin to develop enough confidence to share their own stories because they're very valuable, they're important, and it's really what the reality is. And my family was not, I read about these tiger moms and, kids, playing piano and stuff, and we didn't have any money for that stuff. So, here's your reality, share that.
Yes, Ron, thank you so much for sharing that. We share our stories, and while we face history, we also face forward. And so, Michelle, I like how you talked about how it's important how we hear and listen to ourselves. And Carrie, also how you said when it comes to the model minority myth, we're very visible by our difference. And so we have three questions, but I'm going to try to collapse them into one final one before we move into our Q&A. So Dispensazu, if I could have a little bit of your grace as I try to collapse the three final questions into one. And if our panelists wouldn't mind just perhaps grasping onto one aspect and then sharing specifically on that one aspect. So a lot of us have discussed the roles so far that AAPI communities have played and continue to play in the US politics of race. How have AAPI/Stop Asian Hate movements interacted with Black Lives Matter based on your observations? And what does the future of collaborative anti-racism look like in terms of coalition building, in terms of relationship building? Thinking about the cultural forces that brought us here, what do you think are some of the buried histories and maybe some of the shared histories that can aid in that coalition and relationship building? And as many of you have mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Act remains significant to several of your intergenerational experiences. How do you see the experience of AAPI identity working intergenerationally? Some of you brought up observing your aunts and your uncles and the different generations. Michelle, you said even within your own family, you see different interactions in the different iterations of the term. And so bringing this conversation full circle from exclusion to inclusion, what does an inclusive future look like?
I hope I'm not over talking, but just to share from my experience, back in the 1970s, when the Asian American community was active in, for example, the preservation and restoration of the Chinatown International District area, what's been left out is the fact that it wasn't simply these young Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino American student activists who were at the forefront of that movement. It was a multiracial movement. There were many African American, Latinx, Native American leaders who were part of that movement. The reason I mention that is I know I was there. But somehow that's been lost. Back in the 1950s and 60s, there's an organization called the Jackson Street Community Council, group of multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition that was involved in helping push for social programs and community improvement. African American, Filipino American, Chinese American, Japanese American, multiracial movement. Nobody really knows about that. So there's a lot to, as you just peel back in time, you'll find that there's a lot more that we have worked on collaboratively. And it's our responsibility to rediscover that history and to push it forward. There was a huge African American community I grew up with, and it's part of my experience. So we've crossed these boundaries before. We need to reimagine and find new ways to collaborate. And I think that's happening in the Black Lives Matter movement, and then in some of the pushback against the anti-Asian violence more recently.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could just speak to a little bit about kind of the back in my day, we called it the Ethnic Minority Advisory Council for, as I said, my background is in behavioral health. And we found the coalition building is basically kind of like a rainbow coalition, but it was a committee at the state level that focused on our ethnic minority communities or communities of color that were not receiving equitable access to services. So early on, I mean, we think about the ways that our different communities of color have come together to really, that coalition building to achieve a larger purpose. And understanding that when we come together, our voices joining together, and around against, you know, racism, around ensuring that there's equitable access and ensuring that there's inclusion and ensuring that there's cultural competency in all the services that we're providing. And I think that when we look back in our history about how has that been effective, it really brings us forward now to all the anti-Asian rhetoric and sentiment, and how does that fit in with Black Lives Matter movement, as you were bringing up, Tabby. I think it just reminds me of all the great fit that we had before, because it's about fighting racism. It's about fighting the hate against because you're somehow different, because we're not white. I know that seems very blunt, but basically, you know, I feel like it's a very natural way for us to come together and to strengthen the voices that all of us share around eliminating racism and stopping hate amongst different groups of people.
I feel so inspired by listening to Ron and Carrie, what you were saying. And it made me think of, because Tabby, you brought up the Chinese Exclusion Act and how it continues to play out in our lives. And I was thinking of a discussion I once heard one of my uncles talking around the table in California, and they were trading stories on how on my mother's side of this family, it was well known that they were paper sons. You know, they came in under false papers because that was the only way to try to that was the only way to do the jobs that they were hired to do in the United States. Okay. Can go into more history of that, but I remember when my uncles were saying, oh yeah, it's so funny that this is how we got here into the United States. And then the conversation shifted over to Mexican or immigrants from Latin America, and they said, oh, but those people, they should follow the law. And I always wondered, what's the disconnect between recognizing that we have this history? So it wasn't enough to know the history. There is something about our placement, having lived in the United States for multiple generations, that made it difficult to extend that kind of empathy we give to our ancestors to other people who are trying to do similar things right now. And I don't have any pat answers, but it makes me realize how difficult this project is, because Ron is talking about the long history there has been in the United States of collaborative cross-racial cooperation to address structural racism. And yet those moments weren't enough, or not enough yet. I think cumulatively they do have an effect, but it's easy to forget those moments. And on one hand, we can remember the history. Yes, absolutely. And I also, think within my field, because my field is so much about storytelling, back to this question of how we speak and listen to each other. I'm thinking of a book that I read recently. I'm teaching right now. I'm so excited about it. I'll plug Kathy Park Hong's book, Minor Feelings. And she is a poet, right? Yes. Okay, Tabby can talk about more about it too. The subtitle is called An Asian American Reckoning. But she's not talking about her identity per se. She's talking about the way that she can triangulate what it means to be as an Asian American comes through her ability to speak nearby other people's experiences. Speaking nearby the experiences, yay, there it is, of other Asian immigrants for sure, but also speaking nearby the experience of queer folk, of African American folk, of other people who, as someone with an Asian face, people don't usually think she would have any association with. But by speaking nearby and modeling for us in that book, how she's listening to comedians like Richard Pryor and taking deep meaning for understanding how she has been racialized in the United States, and how she too must speak up, but in a way that's going to sound differently than how Richard Pryor did it as a comedian in the 1970s, as one of the first African-American comedians that was on the national screen. that she's using by speaking and listening nearby other people's experiences to help her think about how someone who's been made invisible in a black and white binary has mean that Asian American bodies have also been less policed. We have had the opportunity to enter spaces differently than Black bodies, than how a Black body would enter into that space. But because we have this experience of moving into, I'll just put it very bluntly, though it doesn't capture any complexity, Black and white spaces, it helps us think about how we can move the discourse of what it means to be empathetic and to listen to other people's experiences. We can say similar things at the core to what people who are Black are saying right now, but it sounds different when it comes from people who look like us. We are an example of how we have the more multiplicity of voices we have about sharing stories, and how we have history has marked our bodies personally and our family histories. The more we can hear and say it, we can give more opportunity for other people to hear a different way of pattern making of what it has meant to have a quote unquote minoritized experience in the United States, so that we don't become the model minority whose successes become pitted against other people's. But this becomes an opportunity to have a different way of connecting with people who have been marked as different.
Can I just insert a real quick story as I was listening to Michelle talk? I think we have a responsibility as AAPIs to also acknowledge the contributions of other groups who supported our movement as well. There's a chapter in my book which talks about the Japanese American redress movement, which was headed up and really born in Seattle, national movement, which achieved success in terms of repatriation, restitution to victims of incarceration during World War II. As I write in the chapter describing what happened, the African American community was really instrumental in making that happen. I wrote about two women who were involved who nobody knows, because it's the men who get pushed out front as sort of the leaders that made that happen. But the Congressional Black Caucus was helpful in moving that forward, and worked with a friend of mine, Japanese American woman who was behind the redress movement. As redress began happening on a state and city level, George Fleming's first African American state senator was one who pushed forward redress for state employees who were impacted. T.J. Vassar, the Seattle School Board, African American member, because we didn't have that many Asian Americans in elected office at that time. He was the one that introduced the legislation. So again, we have a responsibility as well to acknowledge other groups who have supported us, and then also to support them in their movements and their struggles as well. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you all for talking about the responsibilities we have in imagining a collaborative future, a collaborative, inclusive future together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. At this point, we're going to transition to some Q&A. We've actually gotten so many really incredible questions. And I just wanted to open with one that really had a personal touch to it. This person says, I grew up in Hawaii and never really experienced racism until I moved to Oregon, and it was an eye-opener. I struggle to find other Pacific Islanders to connect with that have the same experiences. We feel like a fish out of water. What are your suggestions for some of us who know we won't return to Hawaii? How do we keep those connections alive? How do we continue and keep our culture alive and share it with the next generation?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I read that question in the chat, in the Q&A section, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, the many times my friends and I would go to Hawaii so that we could feel at home, comfortable, to be surrounded by other people that looked like us, that sounded like us. And and I understand. I mean, what happened was that I traveled across the ocean so that I could be in a more home-like, comfortable environment. And it's kind of like what I said, what I said about where you are geographically makes a big difference. Just like when I was in the Bay Area, again, I was hearing 10 to 15 different languages every day around myself. And there was a feeling of belonging as a result of that. And I think that, you know, finding where you can be comfortable and at home and be your true self, be your, as people say, your authentic self. It is a challenge to find those spaces where you can continue to grow, to be who you are, finding other people with shared values that maybe they, so yeah, I think we gravitate towards people that have a shared worldview and shared values. Maybe they don't necessarily look like us or similar, but I think it drills down to having shared values and shared belief system about what's right. And yeah, and really tell your stories. My mom just passed away earlier this year, 101 years old. You can't imagine how many stories I was trying to grasp from her, and just, you know, from childhood till now. And it's so important to speak to our aunties and uncles and our relatives and our friends. And it's just like in, you know, talking, both Michelle and Ron talked about stories. And when we read other people's stories, they resonate with us. And it's important to hear and read other people's stories and to make sure that they get out there. And that's how we carry on. That's how we carry on what we believe in and what our culture is. And frankly, as you know, our culture changes, right? Over time. It's, you know, I was raised by a mom who was born in 1919. She brought a lot of that with me, but I also have to pass on to you the values in a different way. It evolves to my daughter. So, yeah.
It's really true to, as the University of Washington is a state school, but we get students from everywhere. And it's interesting to have the students from Hawaii come into Seattle, because they experience something that I think Joanne, who asked this question, is talking about. They feel so disorienting and disembodying to realize that their bodies, their Asian faces, their Asian bodies are being read very differently here in the mainland than they are in Hawaii. And it's been really interesting, I mean, to think about the history of Hawaii, with the reason why it has so many Asians there. It's part of a experiment the United States ran to try to replace slavery, by bringing in different Asian groups and pitting them against each other in the hope that they would not form a labor coalition to question white ownership of indigenous land. And when you look at the history of Hawaii, on one hand, it has this vision of inclusion to it, but it also, and I get this from talking to my students and also being part of Asian American Studies, which is talking about Pacific Islander issues as something that brings up a set of issues that are different than people who grew up in the mainland. But it's also, Hawaii is known for its inclusion, but it's also a place where there's been a lot of rough edges of history rubbing against each other, of land appropriation, who is able to self-govern, who gets to speak. It's a different kind of racial hierarchy in Hawaii that reads very differently than the United States. And so it's really interesting to think of Hawaii as a place where we can imagine of a place that we want to make it a place where it has a different kind of openness to difference than we do here in the mainland. And yet that the conversation there too is really, from what I understand, because I have not been to Hawaii, but if I understand from people who are there and people are thinking about Hawaii, it's also a place that's evolving to think about how multiple conflicting histories are bringing context to what that openness can look like.
Thank you both, Auntie Carrie and Auntie Michelle. So, Auntie Carrie, you talked about the importance of listening to our community and the aunties and uncles. So for the entire duration of this panel, I have had to stop myself from using some kind of honorific of auntie and uncle, because culturally, coming from the island of Guam, it's disrespectful to talk to our aunties and uncles without mentioning so. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Auntie Carrie. So now I can I can be more comfortable calling you Auntie Carrie. And Joanna, I really appreciated your question. Similar to you, the very first time I experienced the term AAPI was moving to Pullman, Washington from the island of Guam. It was the very first time I had ever heard that I was AAPI. It was the very first time I had ever been named Asian American. And to this day, I confront issues of identity all the time. So I selfishly I wanted to moderate this panel simply because I don't feel for myself that the term always fits. And speaking of the invisibility and trauma, and my intergenerational experience as a third generation Filipina from Guahan, it was very difficult for me to situate myself in this term that I didn't hear growing up, that was unfamiliar to me, and the way and interpreting my difference between the islands to the continent. So to answer your question, it's something that I am constantly negotiating, and similar to what Auntie Carrie and Auntie Michelle had shared, I feel as though sharing stories is important, and also coming up with language to share that we feel best fits. And so a story that I often share when I moved to Pullman was I had difficulties relating to people. And so I would grasp onto the thing that I knew most, which was food. And I learned very quickly that people in the continent like bread and cheese. And I don't know as much about bread and cheese, but I learned about bread and cheese so that I could have something to talk about. But I always missed the food that came from home. And so a lot of my research on identity deals with food. And I couldn't imagine my grandma or my mom saying things like, oh, I have a liminal experience and I'm intersectional. But I could imagine my aunties and my uncles and my mom and my dad saying, yeah, I'm sapin sapin, I'm halo halo, I'm ube, and using words that come from our cultures to describe and name who we are. And so based on my observations and the listening to their generational experiences, I came up with language to talk about who we are in a way that made sense, in ways that would feel comfortable within my community, and that wouldn't make me feel alienated from the food and the culture that I know and I love, and that I wanted to remember, but also relate to others who may not share the same experience.
Food is a great language.
Thank you guys all so much for those really thoughtful responses. We've just had such rich conversation that unfortunately we only have time for one more question. And selfishly, I'm gonna put a little bit of my own kind of questioning that I've been going throughout this panel as well. But I think it dovetails nicely with somebody who submitted a question. So I was wondering, what are your reactions to the Washington State School District of North Thurston reclassifying Asians as white this past year, claiming that, quote, Asian student results skewed data? And I think that this dovetails with something that's, I can't remember the exact person who submitted, but they asked, how would the panel comment on Asian Americans becoming a majority in America? I feel like the two kind of go hand in hand. So I'd love to hear your responses on that, which is something that's happening directly in our state.
Well, I can go first. So I imagine everyone has something to say about this one. When things happen like this, it really troubles the notion that things are improving. Things are so much better now than you name the time period. late 19th century, better than the 1960s or 1970s, better than X. This is the kind of move and meant to create division and take away the power to name who we are that is so common to what happened in early historical eras. And it really takes away this notion, it treats Asian American just as a demographic description rather than a term that has the power to critique and reconceive the conditions and stories by how we all belong in the United States. So I know a lot of people probably want to say something on this, so I'll stop it there.
I'm going to keep my comment very short because it really has to do with erasing our individuality. We're being termed white, and even with the, you know, we've been discussing the term AAPI and all its variations, and in each of those are descriptions, and based on our experiences, they elevate our not only our collective similarities, but our individuality. Not once have any of us talked about there's like a merging of that and erasing our individualness. And so to me, it is, I don't totally back up what Michelle said. It is destroying our ability to name who we are. We identify who we are. It's self-identification. For us to be labeled as something else, yeah, it's, to me, it's erasure.
I'll try to be brief too. It's wrong and it's stupid. I mean, you know, there are different Asian American groups that on any given measure perform higher than, you know, another Asian American group. Or what about Pacific Islanders? There's a vast diversity between the achievement levels or needs of Pacific Islander groups. I used to work for, the last job before I retired was at International Community Health Services, which served principally the immigrant refugee community. We had a huge East African population we served, but they were different from the African Americans who had been here for generations, their needs and their demographic information. So we need to have that level of specificity for each group. They all need to have their own category. You know, life isn't, you know, that simple, you know, that you can just sort of put people in boxes. It's a lot more complex. And so, yeah, stupid, you know, kind of not right.
As a final comment on that question, I do think it's important that we remain critical and interrogate what Michelle had brought up, the historical methods division, because they undermine our solidarity and they undermine the potentials for collaboration.
All right, thank you guys all so much for your just such a wonderful conversation. I'd love to just, I know we're really bumping up against time, but I would love to get just some quick final thoughts from everyone. And I'll just call it out by name so we're not kind of scrambling. Carrie, do you mind going first?
Sure. Final comments? Well, first of all, I want to thank my co-panelists and of course the moderator, Tabby. This has just been an amazing experience. Obviously, what I want to do is I want to have many, many more conversations with Ron, with Michelle, and just sharing stories, because frankly, our stories, as each of you were telling your personal stories, I wanted to jump in and said, yes, I have that experience too, only mine's just a little bit different. And I think that's why it's so important for us to continue to write the stories. Thank you, Ron, for writing your stories. And for us to or do the oral telling, and to be able to have more forums such as this to share those experiences. So valuable. So thank you so much for each one of you sharing your experiences and letting me a little bit into your world, and hopefully I've shared a bit of mine with you.
Perfect. And Ron, do you mind coming next?
Yeah, so I enjoyed this. The next panel that happens, Tabitha should be on the panel and not be the moderator, because she's obviously got a lot of insights, and you, Asia, should be on the panel. So maybe some of us seniors should maybe moderate and have you guys talk, because again, you bring a lot of insight. Yeah, share stories, interview folks in your community, spend time with folks, and that's how I was able to create my book. I spent time with the elders who are no longer around, but I now have a sense of the history and a sense of what came before me. So I feel a lot more grounded. So I think that's very important.
Thank you so much, Ron. And Michelle, do you mind going next?
I'll second Ron's suggestion that I want to hear more from Tabby and Asia as well. I guess my last thought has to be, I'll do with something that I've thought of. This is more to do with what's happening right now, and that's the shooting at the Atlanta spas. And I know that majority of the people who died were Asian descent. But what I want for Asian Americanness to do is to also create space to talk about the other people who were impacted by that. The husband of the white woman who died, and forgive me, I cannot think of names or something that escaped me in the pandemic, but he was an immigrant from Mexico. He was handcuffed for 5 hours without being told what happened to his wife afterwards. He was just handcuffed. And the fact that another man, I think from Guatemala or somewhere in Latin America, he was shot too. All these people who were mowed down, part of anti-Asian hate too, but also this fear of multiracial existence, where people are using these spas as hangout places, to go on a date with their husband, to have Asian American elderly women hanging out there, just on a particular afternoon. I want Asian American, whatever term we're using, the idea of that it be capacious enough to make connections to the other damage and traumas, yes, that other people experience by merit of being part of a multi-ethnic and multiracial community.
Thank you very much for that, Michelle. And Tabitha, please round us out with your closing thoughts.
Oh, Zeus Maasi, everyone. I enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank Humanities Washington for this opportunity to share in the stories, to be able to listen to the stories of our distinguished panelists. And I feel so grateful and honored, Zeus Maasi.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for sticking with us for an extra 5 minutes. I really appreciate that. If you'd like to learn more, please visit humanities.org to find more programs in this series from our partners KUOW, Spokane Public Radio, and Northwest Public Broadcasting. From all of us at Humanities Washington, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, a huge, huge thank you to all of our lovely panelists here. What an incredible discussion. Yeah, just so much, just so full of gratitude. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.